For over a century, the story of where the Pueblo peoples came from was treated as settled. Textbooks agreed on it. Museum exhibits reinforced it, display after display, presenting the same clean, linear narrative to millions of visitors over the decades. Archaeologists had the timeline mapped out with real confidence, built on decades of careful excavation and dating work that nobody had serious reason to doubt. Then the DNA came back, and the numbers simply didn't match the story anyone had agreed on. Not a minor discrepancy, not something explainable with a footnote. The genetic signal coming out of Pueblo communities across the American Southwest showed patterns that shouldn't logically exist side by side. Evidence of isolation stretching back thousands of years, sitting right next to evidence of contact and mixing the archaeological record had never fully accounted for. Something happened here that the standard explanation simply can't cover, and the closer researchers looked, the stranger the picture became. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why Pueblo DNA doesn't tell one origin story. It tells several, folded together and preserved with a level of detail almost nobody expected the genome to hold onto for this long. If untangling a mystery this layered is the kind of thing you want more of, hit subscribe right now, because that's exactly what this channel does every single week. Let's start with what makes the Pueblo world itself so remarkable, before we even get to genetics. Stretching across present-day New Mexico and Arizona, the Pueblo peoples, including the Hopi, Zuni, Acoma, and the many communities settled along the Rio Grande, represent one of the oldest continuously inhabited regions anywhere in North America. Acoma Pueblo, perched on top of its sandstone mesa, has been occupied for close to 1,000 years without interruption, not rebuilt after a collapse, not resettled following abandonment, continuous, generation after generation, in the exact same place. That alone is remarkable. Most human settlements, even genuinely successful ones, get abandoned, destroyed, or absorbed into something else within a few centuries at most. The Pueblo world simply kept going, but that same persistence is exactly what makes the genetic picture so strange. A population staying in one place for that long, marrying largely within a connected network of neighboring villages, should produce a genome with a fairly predictable shape. The kind population geneticists know how to model with real confidence based on hundreds of similar case studies from settled populations around the world. Deep local continuity, clear relationships to nearby groups, lining up neatly with known geography and established trade routes. Instead, the genetic data shows something layered, something that looks less like one unbroken thread running continuously through time and more like several separate threads, woven together at specific moments historians still can't fully pin down. To understand why Chaco Canyon sits at the center of the traditional story, it helps to know how genuinely extraordinary the site actually was. Between roughly 850 and 1150 CE, Chaco's builders constructed massive multi-story great houses, some containing hundreds of individual rooms, aligned with remarkable precision to solar and lunar cycles, connected to outlying communities by a network of wide engineered roads stretching in perfectly straight lines across the desert for dozens of miles in some cases. Roads whose exact purpose archaeologists still debate today, since Chaco's inhabitants had no wheeled vehicles and no draft animals to justify roads built that wide and that straight. It was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most sophisticated pre-contact societies anywhere north of Mexico, and its collapse and subsequent abandonment in the 12th and 13th centuries has been debated by archaeologists for well over 100 years. Here's the textbook explanation, the one that held for generations. Pueblo peoples, this version goes, descend primarily from the ancestral Pueblons, once referred to using an outdated and now largely retired term borrowed from a neighboring language, the people who built the extraordinary cliff dwellings and multi-story complexes at Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde. Sometime around the 12th and 13th centuries, a combination of prolonged drought, resource strain, and social upheaval pushed these communities to migrate south and east, eventually consolidating into the Pueblo settlements recognized today. It's a coherent story. It fits the archaeological record of abandonment at Chaco and Mesa Verde. It fits the timing of new settlements appearing along the Rio Grande in the centuries that followed. It doesn't fit the genome. If modern Pueblo populations were simply the direct, unbroken descendants of the Chaco Canyon builders, moving as one cohesive group and resettling together in a new region, the genetic diversity between different present-day Pueblo communities should be relatively narrow. Geographic neighbors should look genetically like neighbors. Instead, some Pueblo communities carry ancestral signatures that diverge from each other far more than a single migration, single culture model would ever predict, while simultaneously showing signs of deep shared ancestry, stretching back thousands of years before Chaco Canyon was ever built at all. A single displaced population resettling together in a new home cannot explain what the DNA is actually showing. And that's exactly where this stops being a migration story and starts being something considerably deeper, something written directly into the genome itself. Population geneticists studying the Southwest have identified what looks like at least 2 and possibly 3 distinct ancestral components contributing to modern Pueblo genomes. One component connects clearly back to the deep ancient lineages associated with the earliest peoples to reach the Americas at all, tens of thousands of years ago. Another shows closer genetic affinity to populations from the Mexican plateau and further south, a signal that lines up with trade contact historians have long suspected existed but had never been able to map genetically with this level of confidence. There's physical evidence backing up that Mesoamerican trade signal, too, evidence archaeologists had already uncovered well before geneticists confirmed a matching genetic layer. Excavations at Chaco Canyon have turned up scarlet macaw remains, birds native to tropical regions of Mexico and Central America, hundreds of miles south of anywhere a macaw could naturally survive. Researchers have also identified residue of cacao, the source of chocolate, inside ceramic vessels recovered from Chaco great houses, a substance with no local source anywhere near New Mexico. Copper bells, another item with clear Mesoamerican origin, have turned up in burials across the region as well. None of that proves large-scale migration on its own, but it proves sustained, meaningful contact stretching across hundreds of miles. Exactly the kind of contact that could plausibly leave a real, lasting genetic signature behind in the population absorbing it, generation after generation. And then there's a third signal, fainter, harder to pin down precisely. One some researchers associate with older, more isolated populations that may have persisted in specific pocketed regions of the Southwest for far longer than conventional timelines have typically allowed for, communities that didn't migrate in dramatic waves at all but simply endured quietly in place while the wider world around them kept changing. Here's where the archaeology and the genetics start lining up in a way that's genuinely striking. This detail has been known for decades, but rarely given the weight it probably deserves. Certain Pueblo oral traditions don't describe a single point of origin at all. They describe several distinct clans and lineages, each tracing its arrival back to a different time, a different direction, a different ancestral homeland, all eventually converging into the same mesa-top villages recognized today. Hopi oral history in particular describes clan migrations arriving from multiple directions across long spans of time before eventually settling together, a structure of remembered history that maps unusually well onto the layered genetic picture now emerging from the lab. For a long stretch of the 20th century, anthropologists trained in a Western academic tradition that generally privileged written and archaeological evidence over oral history treated these multi-origin oral histories as symbolic, a kind of cultural metaphor rather than literal historical record, an assumption that, in hindsight, said more about the limitations of outside researchers than about the reliability of the traditions themselves. The genome is now suggesting they may have been describing something real the entire time. Naturally, this opens up several competing explanations, and each one sounds genuinely plausible, taken on its own, which is part of what makes this genuinely difficult to resolve rather than a simple case of one theory being obviously correct and the others obviously wrong. The first is what researchers call the assimilation model. In this version, waves of distinct peoples arrived in the Southwest at different points across thousands of years, and rather than replacing one another the way conquest narratives typically play out, they merged, intermarrying, sharing ceremonial knowledge, gradually blending into unified communities over the course of many generations. The genetic layering under this model is simply the residue of many small absorptions accumulating over an extremely long stretch of time. No single dramatic event required, just steady, ordinary human contact repeated often enough across enough centuries. The second theory leans harder into deep isolation. Some researchers argue that specific river valleys and canyon systems across the Southwest, sealed off by terrain that made travel genuinely difficult for most of the year, could have sheltered small, genetically distinct populations for extraordinarily long stretches, thousands of years of near-total separation, broken only occasionally by contact with the outside world. Under this model, the layers showing up in modern DNA aren't the residue of repeated migration waves at all, but the fingerprint of populations that sat largely untouched for millennia until much later, blending events finally pulled them together, likely tied to the same social upheaval that reshaped the region around the time of the Chaco and Mesa Verde abandonments. The third theory is the most disruptive of the three, because it challenges the underlying timeline itself. A small number of researchers have proposed that the people of the Southwest may be considerably older and more complex than the standard single migration framework allows for. The familiar story of one wave crossing the Bering Land Bridge, moving south, and then eventually moving back north again. Under this model, multiple separate entries into the Americas at genuinely different points in time left distinct genetic fingerprints that only later converged in places like the Pueblo world, thousands of years after those original separate arrivals. None of these three theories are fringe science. Each one is argued seriously by credentialed geneticists and archaeologists working directly with the data. Each one, taken individually, explains part of what researchers are seeing in the genome. None of them, on its own, explains the whole picture. The moment that actually reshaped this entire conversation came out of a much broader wave of ancient DNA sequencing conducted across the Americas as a whole. Research drawing genetic material not just from living populations, but from ancient burial remains, analyzed with the consent and, in more recent studies, the active, direct collaboration of tribal nations themselves. A shift in research practice that matters enormously given the field's difficult history of extracting genetic material from indigenous remains without proper consultation or consent in earlier decades. That earlier history left deep justified distrust in many indigenous communities toward outside researchers, following decades of remains being removed from burial sites, studied, and sometimes retained by institutions without any meaningful consultation with descendant communities at all. A pattern in the passage of federal repatriation law in the early 1990s only began to seriously address. Modern research collaborations in this space increasingly involve tribal review boards, community consent protocols, and, in a growing number of cases, tribal members themselves trained as geneticists working directly on the data concerning their own ancestors, a meaningful shift from the extractive research model that defined so much of the field's earlier history. What emerged was a timeline far more intricate than almost anyone had expected going in. rather than one clean population moving in, settling, and simply staying put for thousands of years, the ancient genomes revealed evidence of multiple distinct ancestral populations present across the Americas going back well over 10,000 years. Populations that, at various points, appear to have remained genetically isolated from one another for millennia before later contact and mixing eventually brought them together. When researchers applied that same deep time framework specifically to southwestern samples, the layered signal sitting inside modern Pueblo genomes suddenly made considerably more sense. It wasn't simply leftover residue from one migration event out of Chaco Canyon. It was the genetic echo of a much longer, much older process, ancient populations that had already been separated for far longer than the archaeological record alone could ever demonstrate, gradually converging over thousands of years into the communities recognized today as Pueblo. The researchers working on this weren't chasing a sensational headline. Many of them were geneticists, partnering directly and carefully with tribal governments, working to make sure the research actually served the communities it concerned, rather than treating those communities purely as a source of academic curiosity, the way earlier generations of researchers too often had. But the data itself, regardless of how carefully or cautiously it was gathered, was undeniable once it was in hand. The Pueblo genome wasn't hiding one migration story inside it. It was holding several, layered on top of each other across thousands of years. Here's the twist that changes how all of this should actually be understood. If the layered ancestry sitting inside Pueblo DNA reflects populations that were genuinely separated for thousands of years before eventually converging, then the real story here isn't simply one culture collapsed and relocated somewhere new, the version everyone had settled on for generations. The real story is that multiple distinct human lineages, quite possibly separated since some of the earliest chapters of human presence anywhere in North America, found their way, across an enormous stretch of time, into a single shared cultural and genetic identity. That means the Pueblo world isn't simply a straightforward continuation of one ancient culture moving from point A to point B, the tidy version taught for generations without much room for complication. It's something closer to a convergence point, a place where several deep, genuinely separate threads of human history quietly wove themselves together, long before written language existed anywhere in the region, long before European contact, long before anyone was recording what was actually happening on the ground at the time. That doesn't simplify the mystery. If anything, it deepens it considerably. Because now the real question isn't simply where did the Pueblo people come from? The question becomes, how many genuinely different origin stories can converge into a single people and still leave a legible, readable trace inside every single cell of their descendants thousands of years later? The deeper mechanism behind all of this seems to lie not in any single dramatic event, a conquest, a mass migration, a sudden collapse, but in something far more patient, something the desert landscape itself appears to have quietly enabled over an enormous span of time. The Southwest is a landscape built almost entirely out of extremes, canyons that isolate communities from each other for centuries at a stretch, walls of sandstone hundreds of feet high that made travel between adjacent valleys genuinely difficult without modern roads or transportation, rivers that connect population centers only at specific limited points, disappearing into dry washes for much of the year outside seasonal flooding, mesas that shelter small communities in relative safety for generations while still leaving them within reach of trade routes stretching as far south as Mesoamerica. It's a terrain almost perfectly built for exactly the pattern the DNA now reveals. Long stretches of genuine separation, punctuated by intermittent, meaningful contact over and over again across thousands of years. Rather than large-scale invasions or wholesale population replacements, the real underlying mechanism appears to be something closer to a rhythm, one shaped by a landscape that made both isolation and connection genuinely possible, depending on the season, the water table, and the state of relations between neighboring communities at any given point in time. Isolate, endure, encounter, integrate, isolate again. Repeated, generation after generation, for thousands of years running. Each individual contact event, leaving behind a small, specific genetic signature, folded quietly into the next generation until those accumulated layers finally became detectable to the kind of modern sequencing technology that simply didn't exist until extremely recently. In other words, the mystery here was never really about some hidden, unexplained population that doesn't belong in the story. It's about a process, slow, cumulative, almost geological in how patient it actually was, one that modern genetics is only now equipped to properly read. The desert itself didn't erase these separate histories along the way. If anything, it preserved them, layer by layer, the same way sediment quietly preserves the story of ancient rivers long after the water itself has moved on or dried up entirely. The Pueblo people seen this way aren't some kind of genetic anomaly requiring an unusual explanation. They're a record written not on stone or in any surviving text, but directly inside the genome itself, passed down intact across a span of time most written historical records could never hope to match. Why does any of this matter beyond one region, one people, one specific set of research studies? Because it quietly challenges something a lot of people like to believe about identity in general. That it comes from one clean place, one unbroken line, one simple, satisfying answer to the question, where are you actually from? The Pueblo genome suggests otherwise, and it suggests it with real, hard genetic evidence rather than speculation. It suggests that identity, real identity, the kind resilient enough to survive 1,000 continuous years on top of a single mesa in the middle of a desert, isn't necessarily a single thread running cleanly backward through time at all. It's a convergence, a patient accumulation of genuinely separate histories that never actually had to erase one another in order to eventually become something whole and coherent. Maybe that's truer for a lot more of us than most people would readily admit, even outside the Southwest entirely. What feels on the surface like one simple, clean line of ancestry is often underneath, a quiet layering of several separate journeys, each one still technically present, each one still fully legible inside the genome, if you know where and how to actually look for it. The Pueblo peoples were never really a puzzle sitting there, waiting to be solved by outside researchers. They were, this entire time, already a record, one written with a patience measured in thousands of years rather than centuries, quietly holding on to a far more complicated and genuinely remarkable story than the simplified version anyone outside the community had ever managed to tell about them. There's a fitting symmetry in how this story finally got confirmed. For generations, outside researchers approached Pueblo communities with theories built entirely from the outside, reading pottery styles and architectural ruins and drawing conclusions without asking the people actually descended from that history, what they already understood about themselves. The oral traditions describing multiple converging origins sat there the entire time, dismissed as folklore by exactly the kind of scholarship that considered itself more rigorous. It took genetic sequencing technology that didn't exist until the 21st century, applied carefully and collaboratively rather than extractively, to finally catch up to what the communities themselves had been saying all along, in their own words, through their own oral history, for longer than anyone outside had been willing to take seriously. That's a pattern worth sitting with beyond this one story specifically. Genetics, done carefully and in real partnership with the communities it concerns, doesn't just fill gaps left by archaeology and written history. Sometimes it simply confirms what a community had already known about its own layered, complicated origins the entire time, long before anyone thought to ask, and long before the technology existed to prove it. If untangling a story this deep, this layered, and this patiently preserved is the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe to DNA Exposed. Because next week we go looking for another population whose genome is holding on to more than anyone outside it ever expected. We'll see you in the next one.